Hello, everyone. Today we are going to follow up on our first story of where the second born twin is actually seen as the firstborn twin. We ended that episode talking about patience, wisdom, time, spirituality, and this gets us to a concept or a group of children that are called the child king. In local tradition in Nigeria, they're either called the Ezenwa, Elena, or Dada. But for this episode, I am going to focus on calling them Dada or maybe Ezenwa once in a while, but mostly Dada because that I can remember, right? We're going to start with the biblical history, which we would before we get to tradition. But first things first, let's try to understand what is the concept of this idea called locks or dreadlocks. Now, truth be told, everyone, all type of hair from it's not A, from 1, so it's 1A to D, all the way to 4A to D. So from 1 to 4 hair type, everyone can grow locks, right? Everyone can grow dreadlocks. It just takes a lot of time, well, a longer time for some hair type in comparison to the 4D hair type that literally just grows as locks, or the 4C, which is more entangled and can easily build up to locks, so as 4B and 4A, right? So for the sake of this episode, we are going to be focusing on 4D, not 4C, 4D, which is one of the rarest type of hairstyle out there. The 4D hairstyle naturally mats itself. It naturally turns into locks. It just grows that way. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to palm roll it. You don't have to crochet, and neither do you have to interlock, right? Those are the 3 ways that a non-4D hair can be converted to locks, right? So from 1A all the way to 4C, if they want to grow locks, if they want to grow the general Rastafarian locks, right? And shout out to the Rastafarian people because they really held the line. Understanding your hair type really goes a long way. Before diving into the phases of the hair, we've spoken about 4A, 4B. There are only less than 99% of people on earth that actually has the 4D hairstyle. So our locks, so the next question that, after giving shout out to the Rastafarian, the next question that is being asked would be, are locks natural or are they cultivated or are they artificial? It depends. It depends. You can literally go on eBay or go on Amazon and you can buy locks. On the flip side, if you have a 4D, which is a very few set of people, you can grow it naturally. Has a lot to do with the curliness of your hair and the coiliness of your hair. There's a distinction. There's a distinction between those 2 words. So there are starter locks, and one reason I want to talk about starter locks is a lot of people that do starter locks, in my opinion and my understanding, are usually people with 4A and 4B hairstyle, but they have chosen to work with dreads, and so most of them will braid their hair, right? So they can have a starter locks by braiding their hair. The already existing hair is being braided. And I need you to remember this concept of braiding a hair as your starter locks. You can do twist, which is the new conventional style, because while the hair is trying to get matted and locked in, the twist still looks good and the twist is faster in order to mat. Or you can just do the regular braid. So remember this. And then after they've braided the starter locks, then they wait for it to bud. So during the budding stage, and then there's the teenage stage of locks when you're trying to define your roots. Usually, a lot of people start ending up merging their locks together because at some point you start to see some locks that are very weak. Some of them are dying. So at this teenage lock stage, a lot of people it becomes frustrating, right? Remember the patience, right? Let it sit. It's going to fix itself. Remember the patience story of the twins. This is where the patience comes in locks during the teenage lock stage. But during the stage, a lot of people usually cut it off. While some people, through strength and perseverance, they keep it pushing. They keep marching forward. And then you get to the early maturity stage. This is where you start to figure out, how long do I want to wash it? Do I want to go to semi-free form or do I want to stick to free form now? Right? A lot of decisions are being made in this prematured, and then you're fully matured, right? The locks are fully matured. Everywhere you go, you get compliments. A lot of people I have noticed, they usually categorize these stages of locks by how old your locks have been, like in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years. But here's the deal, right? If you have a 3C and a 4A hair, your locks are going to grow really fast and it's going to grow really long. But on the flip side, if you have a 4D, remember the whole idea about the concept of this episode has primarily focuses on 4D. Right? And who are the 4D? These are the people that naturally grow locks, which means they have really, really thick curls. So before the hair even grows in length, it has to mat. And then after it mats, before it comes down, right? So those are the people we're going to focus on, right? And so after your hair gets to matured or during the teenage stage, that's when some people think about combining, merging, right? Because at some point, sitting down on the chair, taking care of that hair starts to count lots and lots of hours, and then you get tired. So again, it's called a lock journey because of the patience, right? There's the starter stage, there's the budding stage, there's the teenage stage, and then there's the matured stage. But I like to measure the stages of your locks by the length of your locks. So if your locks is between 8 inches and 12 inches, I like to call it you have a matured locks. That's my definition. If you have 8 to 12 inches of strand of locks or bud rope of a lock, I'm like, okay, that's a matured lock. Fully defined, fully clear. But some people define your maturity by age. And the conventional age for them to say you have a matured locks, after doing my research, is between 1 to 2 years. That was not my case. 1 to 2 years was not my case for me to even say, okay, this was a matured lock. Even right now, I'm going on 4 years. I would pretty much say my hair is more in the teenage stage because I just finished merging some of them together. And right now, I'm actually asking myself, do I want to keep retwisting every week, or do I want to get to the phase of semi freeform or freeform? That's where I am right now. Right? There's a lot of patience, a lot of waiting going on here. Word of advice: try to stick with one loctician. Except you have to change state back and forth like I have done. When you move from state to state, it's hard to keep to one. I think that's the issue I'm going through. I'm trying to figure out me and my new loctician. Person's trying to tell me what to do. I'm trying to tell the person, like, no, you don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do because the hair tells me what to do. Right? This is a three-way relationship. Okay. What are some key truths about locks? They're the biological process, right? It's a biological process. All hair comes and all hair can be locked. But there are some that just locks quicker, right? Which is the 4D hair. It requires patience, it requires time. And now we are going to focus into the cultural practices or the cultural beliefs. How people shape or wear, maintain their locks is deeply cultural. Now, those are just using it for fashion. We are not talking about the fashion people. For those that are using it for fashion, have fun. Trust me, have fun. The more the more people that wear locks and hit the street, I want to thank all of you that do that because you're making it more conventional and more commonly known by people. So now this takes us back to the journey, right? We're going back to not the locks journey. We're going back to prehistory stage, right? How it all started, right? Where this whole idea of locks, why people see it as stigma, why some people see it as a religious practice, and where the whole patience comes in, right? We're gonna go back to like the divine origin, right? So, we started, the title is The Child King, right? And the whole idea is people with type 4D hair, that's the hair that locks, which is called Dada. So they're calling the Dada a child that is born with a crown. We'll get to the crime side, but at exception, it was seen as a child born with a crown, right? Fragility in the sense that cutting the hair required rituals, right? And in some culture, if you just go and pum, 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 cut it off, bad things happen, right? And again, we will get to where all this come from biblically, right? Like the divine origin, the fragility and the practices, and the royal naming, right? The Dada, and then the Dada for the Yoruba community and the Ezenwa for the Igbo community, right? So across civilization, where hair grew freely, lock appeared. And with them, a sacred group was created, right? In the Bible, they were set apart as the Levites, right? But it wasn't the hair that made them, it wasn't the hair that made the Levites to be chosen as the priest, right? It was like, Moses was angry because of the calf. And then Moses shouted, who will stand with the Lord? And then the Levites, they showed up and they showed out. And then they were chosen to be the priest because they stood with Moses. That's the story, right? But this has nothing to do with the hairstyle. Just trying to make you guys know how the Levites were chosen, right? Also, even down in ancient Egypt, right? A lot of pharaohs, they've opened some tombs and they've seen them with locks. It was a thing. If you even look at the statues, you see it. So from a sacred crown to a colonial weapon to a cultural crime to a protected group of people, the hair of locks have really evolved over time. First of all, just trying to even know what locks is and how it's maintained and how it's grown, that takes a while. But now this is where we're going to go. We're going to go to sacred. We're going to go to colonial times. Then we're gonna go to the era where they were seen as a crime, still seen as a crime in Nigeria. Like, come on, guys. How do you stop people down the street just because of they have locks? I know I just spoke about the whole NEPA issue and talking about civil duties and this also falls under that, right? You can't just arrest people because of they have a certain type of hairstyle. But let's focus. So between 3400 BC and the 1400s, locks marked kingship, marked priests, and they were marked as divine children across Africa, Asia, and the Americans. Right? So during some period, if you were a child and you came out with locks, you had it good. And between the 15th and the 16th century, during the height of slavery, people that grew locks were targeted because the colonial people saw them as, okay, these were leaders or they were seen as priests, and they humiliated them by cutting off the locks in public. See where does your fancy hair will be. Right? So you can imagine how glorious and beautiful that locks would be if that child kept the locks from childhood and the person was like in their 30s or even in their 20s. So they chopped it up to humiliate them. And then, okay, shout out to the Rastafarians. By keeping the Nazarite vow, they kept their locks. And they were seen as a symbol of African identity and defiance of the colonial masters back when they had already moved to the plantation where they were working on. And today, keeping of locks is still contested. It is still a contested practice. In the workplace, people are rejected because of they have locks. In school policies, some institutions would not accept your child to come in with locks. They were like, no, everybody has usually for the boys. For the girls, I don't think they have that issue that much because if you're keeping sister locks, which is the smallest type of locks, you might not even know the person has lock. But for the guys, it's very, very noticeable. If you're a guy and every other guy cuts their hair and you're the only one on campus with hair, you're gonna be spotted out. You're gonna be like, hey, why does that guy have to have hair and the rest of us don't? So it becomes a thing. So the basic saying is, right, why they call them the child king is like they believe that the heavens, the gods braided their hair before they came in. That's why they call the hair a crown. So if the gods braided your hair, who are we humans to cut the hair? That's how the whole dada and the arc of the sacred hair was introduced. So the question is, if the hair was sacred enough to come from heaven as braided, how did it become dangerous enough to get people killed? From a divine crown to a criminal status. How did this happen? How did this come to be? So let's go back to the Bible's own theology of locks. And again, it builds back to the book of Numbers, number 6. And this is where the Nazarite vow prohibits cutting the hair as a sign of being set apart. So you remember Samson. Samson is the main poster child. And Samson was, and when I mean the main poster child that you get to understand the Nazarite vow clearly. This child should not cut his hair. And in Samson's case, his hair was his source of strength. And most importantly, the child should not drink water. No, the child should only drink water. The child should not drink wine. Imagine if it was our time, they're like, you are not to drink water, you're allowed to drink. And the basic gist of why, like that was a miracle on itself, because back in the days, remember guys, they had nothing like clean water. There's literally nothing like clean water. So if they tell you you cannot drink fermented drink, that's a tough one. Because you're going to be drinking water with lots and lots of bacteria. So that was a miracle. So if you were literally set apart and you kept the Nazarite vow and you drank only water, when they see you moving around and being healthy, they know that you are truly set apart and God is with you. Because those guys back in the days, they drank a lot of fermented drink because that was the safest drink to take. There was no prohibition on that. So again, a lot of people mistake the idea of the Nazarite vow and a Nazarene. The reason why I want to cover this critical distinction is because of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was a Nazarene. There's no record that he kept the Nazarite vow. That's a distinction. So if you were a Nazarene, you just came from Nazareth. But you could be from Bethlehem and still keep the Nazarene vow, the Nazarite vow. And in keeping the Nazarite vow, that has to do with you're being set apart from God. You're required not to drink wine. You're required not to cut your hair. And most importantly, no contact with dead bodies. If not, you'll be seen as unclean. You can see all these rules in the book of Numbers 6, the book of Judges, 1 Samuel, and Acts. What's the duration of the Nazarite vow? It depends. Some people kept it halfway. Some people reached a certain stage and they're like, hey, listen, I've fulfilled the Nazarite vow. And then they would cut their hair. They'll perform a sacrifice and then they will burn their hair with the sacrifice, like you've kept the Nazarite vow. I have no idea why they were burning the hair. Maybe it's something to like let the spirit and the wisdom and the patience that came with the hair go with it. But that was the rituals you use if you cut the hair, right? So again, in some cultures till today, you can't just wake up and cut the hair. I tell people this around me. I'm like, you can't cut my hair. It takes a lot of steps to cut this hair. Don't believe me. So who are the people that we know for sure actually had locks in the Bible based on description and based on the Nazarene vow? Now remember, right? All hair type can keep locks. Just that some people don't grow faster and some people just grow as locks. 4D just grows normally. And then if you have 1A, it can lock. It's gonna take a lot of time, right? Hey, don't get this wrong. The Vikings had locks. I don't know how long and what they put to make it stick together and keep it down. But the Vikings, they did have locks. If you looked at the Vikings, shamans and the Viking priest and priestess, you're gonna see locks. You Google it and you will see. So who are some people that we know? We know John the Baptist had locks because he kept the Nazarene vow. We also know Samson. We've spoken about Samson a great deal. Then the scripture. This is a weak evidence, but it is still an evidence. In Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, he said, the Spirit took me by a lock of my head. That's a strand of hair by a lock of my hair. Right? Now remember, we know that mostly, and even till today, mostly priests, shamans, and in some religion, their gods, they have locks. So this is a weak evidence, but Ezekiel is down there. Then we have Elijah, and he was called Baal Sirah, which is hairy man, master of hair. We're not sure. There's an ambiguity down there, but remember, the reason why we're putting Elijah is because of John the Baptist, because they did say John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah, and John the Baptist depicts everything that Elijah did. So this is where the ambiguity comes in, and that is how Elijah joins this list. Then there's King Solomon in the Songs of Solomon. They describe him as wavy and bushy and curly. We have covered the difference between curly and curly here earlier on in terms of the texture. Now, why? It's a modest way to claim King Solomon, but the issue with King Solomon is he had a son called Absalom. And then they would say Absalom cut his hair off his head like once with some ritual practices, and it weighed 200 shekels by the king weight. So whenever he would cut his hair yearly, or he would maintain his locks, because he's a prince, maybe he was one of the first people that used to maintain the locks, to like make it neat and proper. So maybe when he cut it, maybe they didn't know the idea of crocheting back then. Maybe he cut it, he was trying to keep it clean. Just keep it free form but organized. They had the weight. So if you're gonna wait, like anyone that has locks, and if you lose a strand of a lock, especially a long one, it weighs. It's a heavy hair because it's matted. It's matted and then it gets all tangled up together. So what are some critical analysis of Absalom are trying to prove that Absalom actually did have the hair? I would say in the case of Absalom, how he died in the Bible. He was trying to flee away from some soldiers, and as he was running, his hair got tangled and was caught up in a tree. Didn't say anything about his hair being braided, and the hair was able to hold his whole body weight. That has to be a lot of tangledness in order for a tree branch to be able to hold that. Okay, first, the tree branch had to be heavy, that is right. But just remember, the hair had to tangle as the horse was running through. Wasn't like someone went to go knot it and tie it. He was running fast, passes through a branch, the branch hooks it, and pull him. I only know some few hairstyles that can pull that off. That's how Absalom comes in, and that is how King Solomon comes into the story, right? So we're trying to defend a lot of people in the Bible how they're named. Elijah because of John the Baptist, and he was brought in the spirit of Elijah. King Solomon because of Absalom. Absalom because of his hair got tangled in a tree. He was running on a moving horse. The horse wouldn't be strolling. The horse was speeding because he was running from his life. He lost the battle. And that was where he died. If only he cut his hair or he wore a helmet. But how can he even wear a helmet when the hair is all out? Unique type of helmet. That's gonna be really messy. The NFL players with locks, like people that play the American football that have locks and wear the helmet, you can literally see it. Like as soon as they're done with their first play, they take off that helmet. Yeah, we didn't look into that. Maybe we should have looked into it. Now that I think about it, they have a lot of NFL players with locks. We should have looked into that. We didn't. Then we also have Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul cuts his locks and then later paid for 4 men to fulfill their Nazarene vow. So this is where Apostle Paul also joins the list because of after he cut his hair and then he now paid for 4 other men while he was doing his Nazarene vow. He had to pay for not he had to, he wanted to. Apostle Paul wasn't a peasant. He was Pharisees of Pharisees. He was in the elite. Like, he was actually there when they were stoning Stephen, and he was like, you're keeping the scripture. He was like Rabbi Nicodemus. No, Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel was he's a fun rabbi. We love Shmuel. We're talking about Rabbi Nicodemus. He was like, Apostle Paul was like, he was in the league of them Rabbi Nicodemus. These are the people that their scripts and their letters in the Talmud are still debated till today. Their interpretation of the verses of the Bible, what is true, who is the Messiah, where's the Messiah coming from, how can this be? So that's why his conversion was a huge blow. And that was why he was able to write and write and write. Because he, like Apostle Paul, is like, I may have not seen Jesus Christ of Nazareth, but he's in me. Like, he had written a lot. Like, also this guy, Jairus, the secretary, the scribes of Rabbi, or the librarian. Let's call him the librarian because he was the one that kept all their texts. So we have that, right? He also could testify to that. I'm not saying Jairus had locks. I'm just talking about the connection between Apostle Paul, the rabbis, the Pharisees, and how he came about. So Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11:14, he also criticizes. I'm going to quote his critics just in case someone pulls it out. He said, does not even nature itself teaches you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? Maybe this is the reason why he decided to cut his hair. But remember, Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen. Any of you that have read the Meditation, the Stoics, anyone that read about Stoicism, if you read their books, Seneca and the rest, you will see Apostle Paul there. They write about Apostle Paul. Right? I remember first day I was reading it and I see Apostle Paul. I was like, wait, is it that Apostle Paul? And yes, he is your truly Apostle Paul. In the Gringo-Roman cultural context, he was writing that when he wrote to the Corinth, a Greek city. So he's writing to them and telling them about their culture. And it's like, hey, even we agree it is just not natural for men to grow hair. That's their belief, nature, and their culture. But the strongest connection to Apostle Paul was the ritual after he cut his hair and also paying for the ritual for 4 other people. That's how he made the list, right? So how did this biblical story, how did this culture of locks get all the way to Asia and Africa? Because I know it's mostly Asia and Africa that have this child king and actually puts this as a divine religious spirituality on the hair context. How did this get there? How did it get to Asia? So we have Thomas, doubting Thomas, one of the 12. Matter of fact, Mary Magdalene had tried to touch Jesus when they went to the tomb, when they first of all saw him and they found out, and he was like, no, you can't touch me. Can't touch this. But when he came to Thomas was the only one. He showed up to Thomas and was like, hey, touch my hands. In 722 BC, after the Assyrian army invaded Israel, and during their time in Babylon, 10 tribes got missing. The 10 lost tribes. I would say more. I would say maybe 10 and a half. No. Yeah, 10 and a half tribes got missing. That would be my estimate because not all the Levites were missing. And let's just leave it there. No need to get into this conspiracy. All right, let's just think like they have 10 missing tribes and they fled south down to Africa. Some went all the way to Asia. And according to some other texts, some went to other places. So what are some evidence? We say Samson have very strong evidence. We say Absalom, somewhat weak. Solomon, one step weaker than Absalom. Elijah and John, I'm giving Elijah and John very, very strong evidence with Elijah and John. But based on my analysis, it also drops it down to weak, like 2 points. Ezekiel, like 1 point. What is going on? I didn't make this. I just put it in an algorithm and ran it. And, he gave it. Like Ezekiel, he dreamt and they picked him up. He literally said, but let's keep moving. So that's the Bible, right? Critical analysis. We have evidence to support them. I explained it step by step. What requires more review? What requires more understanding? I've laid it out. King Solomon, Absalom. They also have some lost scriptures. There's some lost scriptures that really falls down on this, right? If you look at some lost scriptures, like in the book of the War of the Lords, the book of Jairus. Okay, when I spoke about Jairus, the librarian, I don't think it's this same time, but it could be him because the book of Jairus or Jairus is gonna be like the book of Jairus, the upright one, because he was the librarian, so he would read a lot of that. The manner of the king, the book of description of the land, the book of the covenant, Acts of Solomon, Chronicles of Kings of Israel, Chronicles of Kings of Judah, right? There are a lot of books that refers and brings this Nazarite vow and also talks about the hair, the texture, and the rituals of some of the kings and some of the old people of back in the days cutting their locks. The visions of Idol, the seer, acts of God, the seer, there are a lot of them. That builds on this concept and builds up on the spirituality. So we end with Samuel. So if you think about it, right? The last judge in the Bible, Samson, we're clear that he had locks. The last prophet that ruled, which is Samuel, he had locks. Clearly stated he was a man with long locked hair. I think in some passages in the Bible, they actually put beautiful long locked hair. Don't quote me on that, but I think I read that. That's why most videos, most movies, when they try to depict Samuel, they don't make his hair locks, but they make his hair very long and he's always good looking. Even when they don't blend the hair with the actor, it's like, what? Like, where did you get this good looking hair? Like, couldn't you find some, like, he has all these rough clothes and then they'll just have his beautiful hair. I'm like, what? Those are the biblical stories. This is where we get the biblical text. And then we move on. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls of 1947. We have the Nag Hammadi of 1945 and different texts that builds on this. Every civilization that has had hair grow naturally developed locks. So now we're getting into pre-modern era. We're looking at their kings, we're looking at their priests, we're looking at their prophets, and we're looking at their children. Usually the children from kings, the children from prophets, the children from priests. A 4D hair passed down through generation, passes down through bloodline. And even minus that, if a kid grows up and they see their dad, that he keeps locks, that is something that the kid is gonna want to talk about. So now this leads me to other religions than Christianity. Because we try to cover religions before we get into culture. And here there's some classic texts that talks about Prophet Muhammad and how he had 4 braids. I need to get that right. Or did he braid his hair in four segments? And they said his hair was long enough to be between his earlobe and his shoulders. So I'm gonna let a contributor that knows more about the text to speak about it and expand about it. Now I'm not saying he had locks, but if you go back to the beginning of what a starter locks looks like and how it grows, yeah. And even in their modern text, some of them in their modern text actually argue and they actually say that this could be a thing. But I'll let the Imam speak and we will leave it at his contribution and move on.
There is a particular book called Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah, the sublime beauty of the prophets. It describes almost everything about the prophets. But we are talking about the physical appearance of the prophets. One thing that any writer should take note of is there is a hadith of the prophet which says, "Man ra'ani fil manam faqad ra'ani." Whoever sees me in his dream, in his or her dream, verily that individual has surely seen me, the prophets. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَتَمَثَّلُ بِي, because the shaitan can never take my form and appear in my form to another person. That is why scholars of hadith, right from the time of the prophets, the companions, they were very careful when anyone comes to them that, oh, I had a dream, I saw the prophets in my dream. Most especially Abdullah ibn Abbas and part of the Sahaba who lived with the prophets, they will question the individual. Okay, this person you saw in your dream, describe such individual to me. One of the criteria they use, or when someone describes what he or she sees in his or her dream to the prophet, when he says, oh, the person I saw looks exactly like Hassan, the son of Ali, they will assert that oh, verily is the prophet that you saw, because they live with the prophets and they know everything about his description. On the issue of the length of his hair typically reached a point between his earlobes and his shoulder. We have authentic narration that speaks about that. One from Anas bin Malik, radiallahu anhu, one of the companions of the Prophet, who described that كان شعر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى نصف أذنيه. That is, the hair of the Messenger of Allah, the peace of Allah be upon him, reached down to the middle of his ears. These are the people who live with the Prophet. They describe the length as that. The same way Aisha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in one of a narration that I The messenger of Allah and I used to perform the major ritual baths from a single vessel. And while she was describing the hair of the prophet, she said his hair, he had hairs above his shoulder level. The word she used was وَكَانَ لَهُ شَعْرٌ فَوْقَ الْجُمَّةِ وَدُونَ الْوَفْرَ. He had hair above his shoulder level, Jumma, and below the earlobes, Wafra. That's how she described the length of the hair of Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And also, there is another narration that one of the Sahaba, when he was describing the physique of the Prophet, who said the Messenger of Allah was medium in height, he has broad shoulder, and also his hair would fall to his ear lobes. That is talking about the length of the hair of Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Also, about the texture, we have narration from Anas bin Malik as well, who said his hair was neither tightly curled and it is not completely straight. That is, it is slightly wavy, not that straight like what we have in this part of the world.
So now we get into the Yoruba tradition, right? They usually call Dada. Dada is the son of Yemoja, goddess of the sea and pre-creation, and the one who divines king. So that is why kids that grow locked hair or matted hair are called Dada, right? Child kings. Among the Igbo community, they also hold the same belief, right? That heaven braided their hair and they're down, and they came and they hold spiritual roles, right? They're either kings again or they are priests in their local shrines or their place of worship, and they are also prophets, right? People that can speak to the gods and communicate with humans, that stands at the intermediary. So this culture holds the same in Yoruba and Igbo. The crown that they wear, the natural crown that they wear, is their hair. They also see their hair as a source of power. And you cannot, following the Nazarite vow, you cannot cut their hair without some certain form of spirituality and rituals. You have to take steps. And failure to do the rituals and follow this step according to their practices can result in the child's death. So again, in order to cut the hair, a day is set aside, the offerings are made, then the shaving of the head, and then they can move on. Failure to follow 1, 2, 3 steps, then you get to the consequence, right? Of not doing what needs to be done. And according to some traditions, they will say like within 3 days, because of you failed to take the 3 steps, so within 3 days after you cut the hair, it's believed that the child would die. So the ruwata, the rituals to shave the hair, ingredients are blessed. So you select a day, then the ingredients are blessed, then the rituals to cut the hair is done, then the hair is buried or kept, right? There are different type of burial. Like you could keep it in your house, or you could bury it in the ground, or you could burn it, right? You could burn it with the sacrifice, just like the Nazareth. You could burn it. So it's safe to say 3400 BC, pharaohs and their juries on their hair, we saw them with matted hairstyle, matted locks. In India, Shiva Jata, oldest written records of locks, is the oldest written records of locks. In 1500 BC. In Greece, in 1700 BC, there were statements of people with locks, with matted hair in Europe. Ethiopia, 500 BC. The Tibets and the Sikhs, the people that practice Sikhism, right? The Sikh religion is very, very similar to that of the Nazarite vow. Very similar, 100% similar. When you look at Sikhs and how they protect their hair and the shaving and the cutting, very similar to the Nazarite vow. In Poland, 17th century and 19th century, they identified people with matted or locked hair that drew illness from their body, and cutting it could be very fatal, so they had to leave it. Because of they believed with the matted hair, as it grew longer, it was pulling out the dirt from inside them. And anyone that cut it off, like, could prove fatal to the person that their hair was cut. Again, very similar to the rituals of other community. You can't just cut the hair without following steps. We've spoken about West Africa, the Igbo, and the Yoruba, and also in Indonesia, the Zedic priests, the Polish late 17th century, the Tibet or the Tibetan priest, and even in Senegal, the Baal folk, Senegal, a Muslim group of community who still to this day, they wear locked hair. So African ancient crown, right? We've spoken about the pharaohs and some of the pharaohs' tombs that have been opened, and we've seen them with literally locks with their bones or their mummified body. In China and in Tibet, some group of communities in China and Tibet, they actually practice this and they celebrate the monks who wear locks. In Americas, they have the Aztec priests who wore matted, blooded, clothed locks. A very, very interesting way to wear your locks. But hey, we are not judging people of the past. We're just telling you their history. And then we've covered Europe. So according to the Indians, Shiva hair holds the sacred river. So Shiva, the god Shiva, and this could be found in the oldest written texts, right? That the hair holds the sacred river that flows. And the hair is not just symbolic, it is a cosmic plumbing. Until this day, this is how the world is kept together. Very, very interesting story. And if you remember, the world is 70% of water. So you can't just overlook what they're saying. They might know a thing or two or what they're trying to express. In the Babylonian era, King Nebuchadnezzar II, this should have been spoken about during the biblical time, right? King Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian captivity of 605 to 536 BC, right? Locs was used by their priests in those days, and locks was used as a way to identify nobles, right? A lot of nobles wore locks, right? Because if the king had matted hair or braided hair and he wore a crown, like in Pharaoh's time, right? Like, and I mean Pharaoh's time, like Moses, right? So Moses ran to the promised land, and then now the Babylonians are coming to take them back as slaves again, right? So this was a thing, right? Keeping the matted hair, and I think most importantly, unlike John the Baptist and Elijah, the royal family, they would have people to take care of it to make it look beautiful. Because locks can be beautiful when done well. It can look very, very beautiful when done well. In Africa, in Kenya, the Mosaic warriors, known for their reddish, again, going back to the reddish, going back to the Americans, the Azan tribe that wore it reddish, the Kenyans they're also wearing it reddish. In South Africa, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, Celtic Vikings, we've spoken about Poland. All these communities have well detailed records of people keeping locks. Now this gets us to slavery era and the Middle Passageway, where locks became a weapon or where locks was criminalized. Because as they put the slaves into the boat, they were cutting the hair, and those that they knew grew locks were used and punished more. And so they shaved it. They were forcefully shaved, seeding the hair, and as a result, this was the birth of the Rastafarian. This is the whole idea of the Jamaican and the Rastafarian and the restructurization and the rebellion of colonial rule. Because a generation came to know what happened, and they were like, okay, if you're going to punish people that have this type of hairstyle, then we're going to wear it so that you punish us more. This was how the rebellion and everything came about. And the Rastafarian, they built it like the Locs became a symbol to resist against the colonial social order. This is kind of resisting against Babylon. So the Rastafarian are colorating the colonial order with the Babylonian order, which came in during the Lost Tribes to put in their way of life. And they're like, you know what? We are going to keep the hair and do what you may. They were not taking the hair off. And, they were trying to reclaim their African heritage. Remember, if you were born with the locks, you were seen as king, priest, prophet, and you were from a distinguished noble family. And so it was a way of re-identifying themselves. So again, and then this leads to the Middle Age passage where people start to use hairstyle as a map, which helped a lot of slaves to escape. So I couldn't really dig into deep history how finally they let the slaves keep their hair or their matted hair. But it became a thing, the hairs were left. And then they started drawing road maps on their hair, like braiding road maps. And that was how a lot of slaves were able to escape from the South down to Mexico and live free lives. And shout out to the Mexican brothers that defended those slaves, even when multiple times the South went into Mexico to try to reclaim the slaves, and they did not. They like, this is a free land. You cannot take those people. So shout out to those guys. And most importantly, shout out to the Rastafarians. We don't give them enough credit because those guys, they held the line for centuries. Before this research, I always thought that the Rastafarians was the genesis of locks. It was during this research that I started to realize and I started to identify that, this goes back way in the biblical era. This goes back to the lost books that are not in the conventional Bible that we all have. This goes back to priests and practices in Asia, in Africa. This goes back to multiple holy books. So what are some global comparisons? We have the Yoruba, we have the Igbo, we have Kenya, Indian, Jamaica, Sudan, Ethiopia, the Sikh. So we have Sikhs, uncut hair. We have the Ethiopia priestly locks, historical Ethiopian priestly locks, their sacred tradition. So again, the Ethiopia priestly lock, this goes back from the Levites, part of the Levites generation, a bloodline located in Ethiopia. The Jamaican Rastafarian, the dreadlocks, the Indian, the chata, matted hair. In Kenya, I think the whole idea dreadlocks came from the political dreadlocks in Kenya when they had the Mau Mau rebellion of Kenya of 1952 to 1960. So Africans, they grew locks as an act of political and spiritual rebellion when the colonial authority deemed anyone with dreadlocks as a threat to them. So people wearing the dreadlocks were attacked. So this is the beginning of where it became conventional wisdom, and that was how the locks got the name dreadlocks. It became a thing. And the criminalization of the hairstyle, this was during this Mau Mau rebellion. This is when it became a thing. So after the slave, the Mau Mau rebellion, and then it moved on to modern times, discrimination. Locks deemed as dirty, unprofessional, black children removed from classroom, adults fired from their job. Like this is terrible. This is fully terrible. And then in California, the Crown Act was passed in 2019, just like literally, just some few years back. 2019, the Crown Act was passed and it became illegal, and it was infringing on the rights of people that wore their hair natural to be discriminated. So the Crown Act came, right? So you see this full circle, it happens. First of all, the kids, people born with the hair were called like people that came out with their crown on their head. Then it became a way to discriminate and murder. We're talking about Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion, and even down in the US and in different parts of the world. And then now we have the full Crown Act in the United States in California, which has spread across at least more than 20 states right now. More than 20 states recognize the Crown Act. So kudos. So the journey of Lux has 5,400 years timeline from Egypt, or from the Paleo Hebrew to Egypt to Greece to India to Ethiopia to the Colombians to Poland to Senegal to Jamaica to Kenya and to California by passing the Crown Act and protecting individuals with locks, or people that just want to wear locks as a fashion, as a protected civil right. What was sacred enough to be braided in heaven should be sacred enough for us to protect as human. And then this brings me to a study that I came across. The first study is called Childhood Dreadlocks, Dada Hair, Perception and Healthcare Seeking Behaviors. Right there. The second article is Dada Hairstyle, Powerhouse for the Mami Waters Spirituality and Spirit Possession in Traditional. I think they spelled the Igbo wrong. They spelled the Igbo with an E, but maybe I'm pronouncing the word wrong. Maybe it's something else. In religion, in cult religion of the Afghari people. So yeah, maybe it wasn't Igbo they were trying to say. I'm the only one that's just looking at it as Igbo. And if you get it right, well, kudos. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you got it right. I didn't get it. The first paper just talks about hygiene. And when I read it, the only thing that I could come across was some people neglected their hygiene, and so then they fell sick. I'm greatly, grisly paraphrasing it. And because of they neglected their hygiene, that's why they fell sick. And it was a clinical study of 273 caregivers in Enugu state of Nigeria. And they conducted the practice and they found out that 45% believed in the Dada concept, which is they believed in the story of their elders, which, fun fact, you should believe it. And they practiced in two sites territory. So they used two different hospitals to analyze this. And when they're talking about caregivers, they're talking about caregivers that have children with Dada. And they were trying to understand if they believed in details or if they practice in cutting of hair. And then the author goes with some recommendation like, okay, if you're going to follow this tradition and you're going to follow what they say, at least cut the child's hair after doing your spiritual practices, watch the hair. And they were just giving some basic hygiene recommendation, which the Nazarene vow literally said don't cut the hair. It didn't say don't watch the hair. So even when I was reading it, I was like, what does this have to do with anything? Why are we talking about hygiene? Again, going back to the stereotype, right? Going back to the stereotype about the hair. And so they suggested in their study that whenever the child with the Dada is sick, where do they go first? They found out that 11% went to a prayer house. They also said 46% do not give their children vaccines. Not my word. Is the researcher's word. These numbers are correct. 46% are anti-vaxxers. This could become a thing in the US. Like, let's look for all those. California's already anti-vaxxers already, so that's already a thing down here. So don't worry. If you're scared, you can run down here. All right, they said 11 again went to prayer's house, and if the child is sick, they didn't go to the hospital. Listen, prayer Well, this is what I'll say. Prayer houses work, okay? I'm a believer. And less than 1% gave doctors the time of day. When they mean they gave doctors the time again, they gave modern MD doctors the time of day. But they went to the traditional doctors. And those people in the traditional house, they have traditional healings. Talking about traditional healers, these guys, they're real. I kid you not. I met two people. They broke their hands similar way. One went to the west and they put the cast and the hand couldn't do a whole lot of stuff. And then another one that was in the village broke his hand because we're talking about it in the room in our hostel. And the other one broke his hand similar, even worse. And then he said he went to a traditional place and using sticks, woods, and herbs, you wouldn't even tell that he broke the hand. You wouldn't tell that he broke it. So I think the research, not critiquing the researcher, please do not go in and drop bad notes for the researcher. But I think the researcher really short-handed the traditional healers because the traditional healers use herbs and those herbs, they do work. This is not a medical advice podcast. Take everything with a grain of salt. Just allegedly, maybe, perhaps. While the second paper literally goes into the Mami water spirituality and how it's a cult. So I'm just going to stop there and feel free to read the second paper. He talks about the rituals, which we had already covered in the Bible. And, this goes like the whole rituals about people with the hair goes down to the Nazarene vow and how it came about and what was happening. And these people, they believe in it. A lot of people have their practice, even in Poland. So again, the Polish people, they had the same belief about cutting their hair. Same thing in India, same thing in South America, same thing in Indonesia. So do with it what you may. So this is a nice take of the story of Dada, the Ezenwa, and the Elena, the Child King. And this story was a kind of building on the second child being called the first. This builds on the second child being called the first. This builds on that concept. This builds on where we came from in great ideal. So, in conclusion, if a hair was sacred enough to be braided in heaven before birth, how did it become dangerous enough to get killed? And thanks to people fighting for civil rights, they were able to pass the Crown Act of 2019 to protect people with the Dada hair, to protect their civil rights. The crown was never just a hair. It was a way. It was always a declaration of divine power, divine identity, and divine spirituality of a group of people that believes in where they came from, that believes in their practices. Or we could also say the hair is just a nice hairstyle that people like. Do with it what you may with this information. But for me, working on this research, I'm presenting this long document of 97 slides. This is the longest slide I have ever presented in my life. I thank you all for listening. I hope this was educative. I know I didn't go deep into the lecture to get each words and each statement, but the information that I provided is enough for you to do your due diligence and find out that it is a thing. Dada is a thing. Ezenwa is a thing. These religions and this tradition, people have practiced it for centuries. And this is not a primitive belief. Matter of fact, this is the foundation and cornerstone of the Western world. Because as they like and as we like to say, the Western world is built on Christian values. Godspeed.